Hello, everyone. Today I'm speaking to Joel, who's also known as at Future Folklore. I'm going to let him introduce himself to you, but he's here today to talk about religious implications of UAPs. Welcome, and please let everyone know who you are.
Thanks, Deb. I'm really glad to be here. It's always a huge honor to get to talk about this and to share part of my life and my journey into the subject. And, for everybody, there are a million different paths, different itineraries, as I like to think of it, into the UAP subject. And mine happens to pass through some pretty serious and years of religious work. So, a bit of my background: I grew up in the Pacific Northwest near Seattle, so was on the water a lot. Really loved the climate. I actually took the climate for granted because it was just so mild growing up. Eventually, found my way to Dubai. I had a 4 month study abroad trip, which turned into living there, and had a lot of big milestones there. I worked as a business analyst for a while. That was sort of my first real job, I would say. So, yeah, right out of college, getting to study abroad, living in the desert, living in the midst of a very pluralistic context, it really opened my mind and, opened it to the point where it would never go back to the same shape again, where I, would take a trip out of state every now and again, but pretty much stayed in a little bubble in more ways than one. So fast forward a bit, I worked as a university research faculty member at Virginia Tech. I did basically big data computing, scientific computing, working on ginormous data sets involving kind of passive sensor data, recording people's driving habits, trying to figure out why they crashed. And then I turned over a new leaf, and my family and I moved to New York City, and I went to divinity school here in Manhattan, where I still live, where we still live. And so that was a years long journey of really discerning, is this the right thing for me? And it was tugging at me for a long time. I really faced a fork in the road. Do I go to graduate school to study something like engineering, physics, or do I go to divinity school? And it was a tough choice. I really loved both options. Went to divinity school here in New York, and it was just a crash course in life, in people, in a huge variety again of spiritual traditions, and particularly with a very, very super modern Western inflection. So a lot of people who didn't maybe think of themselves as being religious. But all throughout my life, I have been interested in the topic of other life, and I really do see religion and religious epistemology as a really under-resourced discipline for conceiving of other life forms. And so it might seem like kind of a random 90-degree jump from divinity school, and I worked as a clergy member, as a minister at a pretty sizable church here in New York City for many years. And just earlier this year, I stepped down to transition back into the business and tech and science worlds. So this is all fresh to me. Um, I can go more maybe later into some more personal reasons why I made that transition. I mean, I left that work on good terms, but some of my curiosities really got the best of me, and now I'm running Future Folklore, which I'd be happy to share more about.
Well, the first thing I'd like to know is divinity school seems like it covers a lot of different theology. So, what is
Mhm.
the denomination that your church was a part of? May I ask?
Yeah, so it was a Presbyterian church, and I would say a Presbyterian leaning divinity school. So there was a bit of a variety among the faculty, but that was kind of the basic consensus. So, very broadly speaking, it's one of the more major Protestant denominations, has a very, very old heritage going back to parts of Western Europe, and draws a lot of its inspiration from the 1640s in Westminster. um, and so, it's interesting. For the time that I was active as a minister, trying to both maintain tradition, and particularly one that was forged in, again, 1600s in Europe for 21st century New York City. So there's a lot I could say about that, but yeah, it was broadly the Presbyterian context that I was trained in, that I had been working in.
So, the reason we've asked religious individuals and religious leaders to come on this particular show, I guess you could call it. It's not really a show; it's a informative chat. Let's say that is to talk about the religious implications of NHI and UAPs. So, from your experience with divinity school and being an ordained minister, what would you say were hints to you that NHI or UAPs or anything like that might fit into your thoughts?
It's a real open question for me. And honestly, part of the reason that I stepped down from more active work was to pursue future folklore. But of course, like radiating throughout all these efforts in this project that is future folklore is this lingering question: how do these things reconcile? And I don't really know, to be honest. And I felt like I needed at least a pretty good long season to explore that. And it just coincided with the fact that I had something pretty interesting to work on. And so, yeah, it's an open question to me. I think on the one hand, there are some discussions about religions being better suited, religious people being better suited to weather the storm of shocking news of like confirmation of non-human life and intelligence and technology and their presence here. On the other hand, the religious traditions that I'm familiar with, like the Abrahamic faiths, when they conceive of non-human intelligences, they have some pretty particular intelligences in mind, angelic beings, and you know, um, uh, sort of more mysterious beings that are hard to classify. There have been a lot of attempts to classify them. I think of a lot of scholastic theologians who have come up with like very very elaborate hierarchies of angelic beings. So on the one hand, yes, they're used to the idea of non-human life, all the way from God, as the supreme being. And yet, what they conceive of as non-human life is very particular. It's very specific. Um, so I like to think of religions, and this is really a call to people who are like actively doing theological work in any tradition, is do some stress tests on your theological systems. Kind of like they do in banks, right? Where they simulate a crisis situation, or sort of run of the bank, for instance, and can the banking system or a particular bank weather that event? And I think it's a really important thing to do with theologies. Do a stress test on theologies, not just with like, can it handle non-human life in general or extraterrestrial discoveries in general, but also do a stress test on what is unfolding before us right now. I think that's really important, and that's done, I think, a little bit less so. A lot of discussions I see publicly with theologians and other forms of life kind of deal in the abstract. They'll say, there's all this news about this whistleblower, and let's talk about our theology and ET, for instance. And they sort of bypass like what we're actually being told right now and the particulars of what's unfolding. So I think both need to happen, both sort of the big principles question, but also grappling with the news that's sort of coming at us like a fire hose these days.
Well, it's well known that when you act as a minister, the people that you're working with are going to come to you seeking spiritual guidance and counseling. So I have to ask, because some of these things have been unfolding for some time, did people come to you seeking spiritual advice?
Yeah, so when I was active as a minister, it barely came up. Maybe it came up if I brought it up, if I just spoke on friendly terms with people, just about my interests and, hey, did you hear what was on the news? But some people would kind of light up, and you'd realize that they too had been following it maybe a bit. Most people sort of glaze over. It's a curiosity, but it hasn't really like penetrated into their daily life yet. So it was a very rare occurrence. I'm trying to think of a single case where somebody would bring it up themselves. But certainly, since I stepped down earlier this year, because of the intensity of the news that's coming out, people have brought it up with me, and particularly people who know that I was kind of into it. So that's been interesting. It's really, I would say, ratcheted up in the last couple of months since David Grush's testimonies came out in the debrief. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm reassured a little that people weren't flocking to your door. Then that seems to be this misconception that religious people are going to fall apart and they're going to come running and upset and so it seems like that wasn't the case, that for the most part people just went about their business.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I like I brought some of my favorite books. I hope that's okay. Um, so Stephen J. Dick here, he doesn't write so much about UAP or UFOs. I think he's generally skeptical, very thoughtful, but skeptical. But he does write a lot about the societal impact of discovering other life. And one thing that he points out a lot is just the extended process that contact might take, and particularly if it's like discovered from really, really, really far away. This is a little different, right? This is hitting closer to home with claims of like impact craft and biologics and stuff. But nevertheless, I think that his wisdom rings true in the sense that when people sort of hear news passively, that there have been craft recovered, I think they still assume kind of a safe distance from the impact of that news. Like it's stored away somewhere, maybe if it's even real, they think, and it's not like flying around in my face. So they have the luxury, I guess, to sort of take time to absorb the news, right? Um, if there is confirmation of, say, ongoing activity or ongoing contact, and that is sort of presented to people with the same level of confidence and confirmation, like this is not just something that happened off in a remote field or desert somewhere decades ago, but it's still happening. Things are still going on. That might present more of a, I guess, a crisis point. But I think the news still feels a bit remote, even if it's extremely intriguing and puzzling. So that's my 2 cents at the moment.
I do have to wonder if divinity school ever prepared people there for what they would do. What would they do if there's like a major impact to society, like disclosure?
Yeah, that's a great question, and uh, next to nothing, honestly. Yeah, and it's one of the things that I think I'm wrestling with, and part of the reason again that I wanted to step back and to have more freedom to like publicly muse and think through these things is because it's such an underdeveloped area of inquiry. And again, you will find theologians and practitioners who talk about the topic in general, like would the confirmation of other intelligent life present a crisis for like the Christian doctrine of the incarnation, right? The idea that God comes into the physical material world and assumes human form, right? Does that present a crisis for the theological framework of Christian redemption? And there's a lot of wrestling back and forth with that. There's a book called Astrotheology that was edited by a Lutheran theologian named Ted Peters. He's at the Graduate Theological Union, I think on the West Coast. And this is a pretty thoughtful, um, sort of covers the waterfront of all of these discussions. And so, he and others have come up with their own sort of reconciliation of possible discovery of intelligent life and sort of historic dogma in the Christian tradition. I would love to see much more processing of it, though. I think what you find is some theological systems have what I sort of simplistically think of as sort of closed frameworks, right? They are more focused on conserving, preserving, and when you hear them talk about non-human intelligence, it's more like this is not a threat to our system. So that's sort of the slant of their commentary. You can still believe X, Y, and Z. It's not a threat. We can reconcile it. What I would love to see more, though, from especially that camp, are like forward leaning. Like let's just tackle the data as it stands and let's proactively integrate it. Let's look it in the face. Let's ask the hard questions, right? Um, I would love to see more of that. And one interesting thing is like let's just take the Hebrew Bible and slash Old Testament and the New Testament. There's a lot of theological and I guess narrative development even within the the mainstream canon, right? So even within the redemptive historical storyline of the Christian or even the Jewish scriptures, there is a lot of learning. There are a lot of discoveries. There are a lot of things that happen much later in that storyline, the timeline, that people earlier in the timeline would never have imagined could have happened, right? So even I think we need to sort of mine the resources of these different traditions for some sort of analog, some sort of precedent, right? And I think that's the best shot at helping to resituate these different theologies to make room for what seems to be unfolding.
Yeah, actually, when you think about it, a lot of the scripture that people follow are thousands of years old. And I know this will be shocking when I say this, but it has crossed my mind a few times. When will there be a third testament? When will we get the next chapter, the one that's not thousands of years old, but reflects modern times? And I do think one of the issues facing religions nowadays is that people are not feeling like thousands of years old is always in touch with what's going on now, and they're having a lot of issues. So you're right. I think we need to be more forward thinking, um, which leads me to a question. Of course, you've probably heard that NASA received a fair amount of money to ask theologians about this topic, like the religious implications of discovering other life. Did you ever hear any results from that? Like, I don't think we have.
I didn't know. I saw when the news popped up maybe a year or two ago, and even then, I wasn't quite clear on, did this happen already? Is it coming down the pike? And I feel like it just sort of fizzled out. So no, I'd love to hear about it though. Maybe I just haven't done enough digging, but yeah.
I know. I'm like, where is that information? Because the closest we've gotten is some claim that the Catholics want to baptize ET.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, they have been a little bit more, in my impression, a little bit more forward thinking, at least trying to grapple. And they have some mechanisms for, I guess, admitting of new data, new realities. I will say one of the interesting lines of thought in this book, again, astrotheology, if it's not clear in the picture. One of the things I think it was in this book that they point out is there are a number of human disciplines like biology, physics, that have gone cosmic. Like physics has gone cosmic in the sense that physicists generally believe that the same physical laws apply any corner of the universe that you're in. It didn't used to be that way, right? Like the heavens and the spheres operated by different celestial mechanics, celestial laws, and things on the terrestrial sphere operated according to different laws. And physics now has gone cosmic, right? Like gravity is operating up there, just like it does when we drop the apple or the rock or whatever. Um, Biology, in a sense, is going cosmic, right? With astrobiology, trying to conceive of how life originates and how it might originate in maybe more exotic, uh, extreme environments using Earth analogs or even entirely different chemistries, and that's really cool to see happen, right? But theology in general has not gone cosmic. Um, and there are other traditions, maybe Eastern traditions that I'm less familiar with that might be more like naturally hospitable. Some indigenous spiritualities might be more naturally hospitable to like modern cosmology. But in general, I think the Abrahamic religions are lagging behind a bit in that regard.
So, what do you think it's going to take, say, if a UFO just lands, a really giant one, just lands in an indisputable manner? What do you think it's going to take for religions to deal with that, to come forward and counsel their people, their parishioners, their, how are they going to handle that? What are they going to do?
Yeah, some of the mega churches have enough space in their compounds to accommodate such a craft, I suppose, right? They have football fields already, and these football field sized UFOs can just make their happy landing. That's a great question. And um, I'm hopeful in general that people will adapt. Certainly, something like that would be akin to a revelatory event. And who knows what kind of new insights it might prompt. I think your question about like another testament is very poignant because it's a bit controversial to go down this route if somebody's like signed the dotted line of a very strict theological confession. They're a minister. But suffice it to say, at different points of even just like the Christian storyline, there were these points of despair, of confusion, of sort of no revelation, dark periods of no divine communication, you might say. And I think people who are really plumbing the depths of the NHI topic kind of feel that way. Like they're suddenly theological nomads. Um, it's interesting to see kind of where people shake out. Like some just cast it off altogether and say, it was primitive and pre-modern to begin with. It cannot accommodate what's happening. Others think, where else am I going to turn? Maybe they've had like profound NHI type experiences within their tradition, right? And I'm sort of the mind that I don't want to collapse sightings, beings, intelligences, aerial objects that you see like in the pages of scripture. I don't want to collapse those with what people are attributing to them today. Like, oh, they were just craft. Now we know, right? Because of our technical understanding, those were just craft, those were just whatever, and people mistook them for angels or divinities or spirits or whatever. I'm sort of the mind that like, let's stay agnostic, or let's stay open to the possibility that all these things are maybe real, that maybe we have not been mistaking one for the other, and it's really just this, or it's really just that. And it kind of goes to why I started Future Folklore, or particularly why I've positioned it the way it is now. And Future Folklore is a project that is trying to onboard more and more and more people to the search for non-human intelligent life and technology. And when people think of that today, they think, oh, that's SETI. That's what SETI does, the search for ET intelligence. And that is what SETI does. They search for life and technosignatures and signals, and I think that work is great. But I think that we need to like flip on all the possible channels of communication, like open up the entire bandwidth, open up every single possible communication channel, even if most of them lead to dead ends. Because when we think of other intelligences, higher quote unquote intelligences, this is where religious epistemology comes in so handy. Humans historically have not encountered these other life forms and just collected data, run experiments. They have written poetry. They have formed communities of devotion. They have formed communities of like common practice and common experience. Often these encounters are, ontologically shocking, like the term that's being used a lot today. And that's how humans have responded. And so religion tells us sort of where to look, I think. And again, you can use religious epistemology to do work on searching for non-human intelligence today without saying, oh, it's really just spirits we're finding, or it's really just divinities, or it's really just angels. And you can also avoid the other side of falling off the other side of the horse, which is to say, it's always been extraterrestrials, or it's always just been these sort of unknowable, unidentifiable life forms that religions have sort of mistakenly devoted themselves to. Maybe it's everything. And so I'm trying to keep a very open and sort of agnostic mind about the whole panoply of possible intelligence.
I appreciate that, and not to make a pun, but what you've just said is a good way to not alienate people, who are religious and wanna have angels and, things like that still, and stand by that faith. So,
Hmm.
I appreciate that you said that, because a lot of people that I've spoken to about the religious implications so far have sort of said, "You know what? I think there was some stuff in the Bible that could have explained what's going on now." So, instead, what you're saying is this could be something else. This could be
Yeah.
an additional thing.
Yeah. I just don't think that we have enough information either from like sacred texts to explain fully what folks are seeing today, nor do I think what we know today can in any way account for everything that has gone before. I mean, I appreciate attempts at sort of a grand synthesis like what you see in Ballet's work. I appreciate those. I mean, again, I think we should completely open up the aperture and entertain basically any any theory. Um, I'm wary of like totalizing theories that attempt to account for every single part of the mystery. It's really just this or it's really just that. So yeah, I mean, in the meantime, it's a helpful, I guess, spiritual or theological compass to navigate huge tracts of uncertainty.
So now that you have established that, religion can still be, religion and be fine, and then add on this additional issue of potentially NHI, I guess my most important question is just, do you think the Presbyterian faith will be okay in the face of a major disclosure?
Hmm. Um, I mean, don't take my pause as being of too much like weight. I'm just thinking, I don't know. And it's not that like everything has to rise or fall with just this one issue. But it really is, I think, one of the most significant stressors on a theological system. It's such a like stepwise change to go from a theological framework that is basically forged in an entirely different cosmology than the one that we sort of inhabit now. And so it's a huge change. Um, again, I like to think of what kind of similar changes have happened within the corpus of a sacred body of work. Some pretty major changes have happened, I think. Have there been any that are on the same order of magnitude? I don't know. So this is all sort of I guess a meandering question mark. I don't know. I would love to see more people on the front lines really facing this.
Right, and the fact
Um,
is that you came here and you bravely did that. So I'm hoping more religious leaders or former religious leaders will come forward and do the same, because this is a conversation we talk a lot about, but we don't hardly ever talk to religious leaders, which is why I was like, no, we're going to talk to the people who actually led people on this. So I guess my final question, well, of course, I'll ask you how people can contact you, but my final question is, what would you advise to other religious leaders at this point, other than asking these questions, which they need to do? But what would you advise them to do to prepare, to be mindful of this idea, to pay attention to what's going on right now, and open their mind a little bit to prepare people?
that's a great question, and I hope a conversation like this is multiplied like hundreds and hundreds fold, right? Like this, if you ask me these questions like 3 months later, I might have slightly different answers because it's unfolding for me too. So this is sort of just a waypoint in my own journey. I would say like face the news as it's happening in all of its particular and sometimes uncomfortable detail. Don't just immediately put everything in sort of abstract buckets like, oh, the crash retrieval stuff, that's just non-human life. And we know that our theology can handle non-human life, right? Like I read a book on that. Well, did the book know about what's happening now? Or was it sort of just up here in the abstract? So really just face the news, read it as it's coming in. Be very hesitant to I guess come to closure. It's tempting to do that, right? It's comforting, it's reassuring, it's something that makes you come across as confident to your like parishioners. Like they know the answer, right? Things will be okay. You just have to sit in the unsettledness of the news. Um, let's see. I think institutions need to fund a lot more research, and it needs to be prioritized. Because even if for some reason the whistleblower story and all the news of like the last 6 years or so, even if that somehow um, if somebody hits pause on that, if somehow it doesn't keep unfolding with the momentum that we see, somebody's going to find it. I think maybe SETI finally like gets their day and they say we have decisively found evidence of extraordinary technology in a faraway star system. Like it's a different level of like intensity. It doesn't maybe hit you the same way as like they're here, they've been here for a while, and yet it's the same implications, similar implications at least. So I would say it's just a matter of time. So why not get ahead of the ball, right? So it needs to be focused on. It needs to be funded. We have the luxury, basically, of just not thinking about this. Not everybody, right? People have experiences that they cannot avoid and that are very disruptive. I get that, but the majority of people, especially if you are sort of in a very, very enclosed and comprehensive belief framework, just they have the luxury to kind of ignore this, right? And so we've got to be more proactive.
Right. So get past the luxury is what you're
Yeah,
saying and start having the conversations. Is that right?
I think so. Yeah. Um, Read books like this. This is one I just read. It's a classic called The Sparrow. Um, this is a classic first contact novel. I was very late to read it, but it's a group of Catholic Jesuits who decide to take it upon themselves to visit a nearby world that they discover is inhabited by intelligent life. And it is an extraordinary book, not only because of just how poignant the characters are, the characterization is just, I think, unmatched in my recent reading. But really, at the end of the day, I found it to be a story of first contact with God. Like that was the strangest intelligence in the book. And so I think the power of fiction like this, poetry, is that it helps us to lean into our like more religious epistemology, the way that we historically and globally have related to non-human intelligent life, which is through works like this, through literature, through poetics. It kind of activates that register of our relating, and it really primes the pump, I think. And it this kind of book, and even C.S. Lewis, sort of one of the poster child Protestant, more contemporary voices, even his sci-fi trilogy, which is terrific. It really meanders pretty far away from what people would think of as like C.S. Lewis religious beliefs. It's very exploratory. It's very speculative. It's if you were to like take his sci-fi trilogy and turn it into like a systematic theology, it would be pretty weird. But you have the luxury in fiction and creative works to do that kind of exploration, and it's just a really terrific way to test the waters, both for oneself to entertain new ideas that you might not in a sort of left brain logical frame of mind, um, and it just might be a way to discover what's going on. And read a lot of Jeff Kripal. I've attended both of the Archives of the Impossible conference down there in Texas, and just find his entire work and community just absolutely terrific, so helpful. So read widely, read not just theologies, read fiction, read outside of your tradition, um, and just be bold. Take the leap of faith, to use the cliche, because you really do need to.
I think also just as a side note for some, this can actually bring people closer to God than if they can see God as the creator of all things. That's that possibility is there in my opinion. So
Yeah, I mean, for the theologians who have braved this, they often get there. Um, so again, a lot of them are sort of wrestling in the abstract, and yet they still land there. And um, I think that's an entirely viable place to sort of be and to sit, as even like the contemporary news unfolds. And I've seen people kind of going down that lane, and it's worth a search, right? Because if we don't get ahead of it, it's gonna feel too late for some.
well, thank you so much for coming and talking to me and having this conversation about the religious implications. Can you please let people know where they can find you?
Sure, yeah. Twitter, or X, as it's called now. I don't know what to call it. Probably the best hub to chat with me and find out what's going on. I'm future_folklore. You can probably just search future folklore if you forget the handle and find me. And also the website of Future Folklore is futurefolklore.tech.
But wish you the best with all of the endeavors that you have. You have quite a lot going on. I'm excited to see someone who's so innovative in this topic. Please, if you have the urge to have the conversation with some people you know in religious leadership, please do so. I should have started asking everyone. Please start having the conversation, everybody. Thank you again for coming today. And you take care. And everyone listening, take care. And thank you for listening.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks for modeling this very conversation.
Thank you.